The finality of the act was in the sound of the coins, not the sharp clink of silver, but the dull, heavy thud of copper on the polished oak of the lawyer's desk. $20. Mr. Davies, her father-in-law, pushed them forward with a thick, unforgiving finger. It was the price of her banishment, the severance paid for the life she had built, and the husband she had buried 2 days prior. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the far wall, as if she were already a ghost in the room. "Thomas was a good boy," Mr. Davies said, his voice a low rumble of gravel. "He had a soft heart. You encouraged his fancies. That fancy for prospecting is what put him in the ground." It was an accusation dressed as a eulogy. Ilara said nothing. There were no words that could breach the wall of his grief, a fortress he had built with stones of blame. Her silence was taken as admission. Beside the small stack of coins lay a deed. The paper was dry and brittle, the ink faded. It granted her title to a patch of land north of Providence Gulch, a 10-acre plot known to everyone as the Scrabble. It had been in the Davies family for generations, a piece of useless geography held as a joke, a lesson in what land ought not to be. It was a wind-swept hill of shale and stubborn weeds, unfit for grazing, impossible to plow. It was an insult made of rock and dirt. "The main farmstead was always meant for my son," Mr. Davies continued, finally turning his cold eyes on her. "It stays in the family. This is what he left you. This and that." He gestured to the coins. He was legally correct. Thomas had never formally added her name to the primary deed. It was an oversight born of love and youthful certainty, a certainty now buried with him under 6 feet of cold earth. She had nothing. The clothes she wore, a small satchel with a change of linen, and the memories of a man who had loved her fiercely. The community of Providence Gulch offered no refuge. They were Davies' people, their fortunes tied to his herds and his goodwill. They stood in clusters outside the lawyer's office, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They saw a widow, 24 years old, stripped of her home and her future. They saw a problem that would soon be gone. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, stepped forward, his expression one of weary condescension. "The stage leaves for the east tomorrow, Ilara. $20 will see you to a bigger town. No life for a woman alone out here." He meant it as kindness, but it felt like a command to disappear. She looked at his face, at the faces of the others who had shared bread at her table and danced at her wedding. They were already turning away, their duty of feigned concern fulfilled. In that moment, something hardened within her. It was not anger, but a cold, dense resolve that settled deep in her bones. She would not run. She would not be erased. She walked past Mr. Gable, her back straight, and entered his store. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful, hollow note. Inside, the air smelled of salt pork, leather, and dust. She walked to the back wall, where the tools hung like skeletons. She looked at her $20, the sum of her life. "I'll need a good shovel," she said, her voice clear and steady. Mr. Gable followed her in, his face clouded with confusion. "And a pickaxe, the sturdy one, and a felling axe." He stared at her. "What in God's name for?" "For my property," she said, meeting his gaze without blinking. She laid the coins on the counter. The tools cost her $16. With the remaining $4, she bought a small sack of flour, a block of salt, and a box of matches. The weight of the tools was immense, the axe handle smooth and unforgiving in her palm. It was the weight of a new and terrible beginning. She turned her back on the town, on the whispers and the pity, and began to walk north. She did not look back. The journey to the Scrabble took the rest of the day. The land grew harsher with every mile, the gentle, rolling pastures of the valley giving way to stark, rocky inclines. The wind was a constant thief, stealing the warmth from her shawl and pushing against her with an invisible, insistent hand. Her satchel grew heavier, and the handles of the new tools began to bite into the soft skin of her hands. The sun was low and casting long, skeletal shadows when she finally saw it, a lonely hill, stark against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. She stood at the property line, marked by a single, rotting fence post. It was worse than she remembered. The ground was a carpet of sharp-edged shale and pale, starved grass. Gnarled, stunted junipers clung to the slopes, their branches twisted by the ceaseless wind. It was a landscape of failure. The despair she had held at bay for hours washed over her like a physical blow. Her knees felt weak. The town was right. Mr. Davies was right. This place was a grave. She sank to the ground, the cold of the rock seeping through her dress. Tears she had refused to shed in town now burned hot on her frozen cheeks. This was it, the end. She could lie down here and let the wind and the cold take her. It would be an easier death than the slow starvation this land promised. The silence was absolute, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind rushing over the crest of the hill. But as she sat there, a strange quietness registered. The wind howled above her, but here, in a shallow depression at the base of a low, rocky outcrop, the air was almost perfectly still. The sound was muffled. She looked up. The outcrop was no more than 10 feet high, a rough spine of darker, harder rock running along the hillside. It acted as a natural barrier, a wall against the relentless assault of the wind. Curiosity, a flicker of the spirit she had thought extinguished, stirred within her. She got to her feet and ran a hand over the ground in the lee of the rock. The top layer was the same miserable shale, but when she scraped it away, her fingers met something else. Not solid bedrock, but a firm, damp, heavy substance. It was clay, a deep, rich, reddish-brown clay, cool and pliable to the touch. She grabbed her new shovel. The blade bit into the thin topsoil with a grating crunch, but beneath it, the shovel sank into the clay with a satisfying, fleshy sound. She dug another shovelful, and another. It was hard work, but it was possible work. The rock outcrop formed a natural roofline over this spot, and the earth beneath it was not stone, but something that could be moved, something that could be shaped. Section. Despair did not vanish, but it retreated, replaced by a grim, calculating thought. A house of wood would be ripped apart by the winter winds on this hill. But a house made of earth? A house dug into the earth itself, protected by the stone spine of the hill and insulated by the dense clay? The wind would pass over it as if it were not there. For the first time since her husband's death, a sliver of hope, hard and sharp as a shard of flint, lodged itself in her heart. This worthless place had a secret. It had a hidden strength, and she would carve her life out of it. The first week was a testament to pain. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her hands, unaccustomed to such labor, were a raw landscape of blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. The work was brutally simple. Dig, haul, dump. She used the shovel to break the clay in the satchel, emptied of its contents, to haul the earth away from the growing hollow under the rock outcrop. Bucket by bucket, she carved a space out of the hillside. Her days fell into a relentless rhythm dictated by sunlight and exhaustion. At dawn, she would gnaw on a piece of hard bread made from flour and water, cooked on a small fire. Then she would begin to dig. The pickaxe was for the stubborn, rock-hard sections of clay, its jarring impact traveling up her arms and into her teeth. The shovel was for the softer earth, its steady scraping the primary sound of her new world. She worked until the sun was directly overhead, rested for an hour, and then worked again until the light failed. At night, she slept in a shallow burrow, wrapped in her shawl, the cold earth her only mattress. She was not building a house. She was excavating a life. The initial hollow became a small chamber, barely big enough to stand in. She learned the language of the earth. She saw how the clay held its shape, how certain layers were laced with gravel that made them stronger. She scavenged fallen timber from a grove of dead pines in a nearby ravine, dragging the logs back to her site one by one. It was agonizing work. A single 10-foot log could take half a day to move. Using the felling axe and a few scavenged, sharpened rocks as wedges, she split the logs into rough planks. These she used to shore up the entrance and the ceiling of her growing cavern. She learned the art of the load-bearing beam through trial and error. A section of the roof collapsed once, burying her in a shower of dirt and small stones. She dug herself out, bruised and terrified, and rebuilt it stronger, her fear forging a new layer of caution in her soul. After a month of this punishing labor, she had a single, stable, underground room. It was 10 feet wide and 15 feet long, with a ceiling just high enough for her to stand upright. It was dark, damp, and smelled of raw earth, but it was hers. It was shelter. The wind could howl its fury across the hill, but inside her burrow there was only a profound, insulating silence. This small victory felt larger than any she had ever known. But shelter was not enough. She needed heat. She needed water. She needed food. The work expanded. She began digging a second, smaller chamber off the main one, envisioning a place for a fire. The problem was the smoke. A fire underground, without ventilation, was a death sentence. She spent days studying the rock outcrop above her. It was not a solid mass, but a collection of fractured strata. Tapping along the rock ceiling of her new chamber, she listened for a hollow sound. She found it near the back wall, a place where the tapping echoed differently. Using the sharp point of her pickaxe, she began to chip away at the rock. It was slow, painstaking work. Sparks flew in the lantern light, and the monotonous chip, chip, chip became her only companion. After 4 days of chipping, the pickaxe broke through into a narrow, vertical fissure that snaked its way up through the rock formation. She had found her chimney, a natural flue created by the earth itself. The first fire was a sacred moment. She built a small hearth of flat stones and laid a careful pyramid of dry juniper twigs. When she struck the match, the flame caught with a hungry roar. Smoke billowed for a moment, and her heart seized with the fear of failure. But then the draft from the fissure caught it, pulling the smoke upwards, away, and out into the open air. The fire drew perfectly. Warmth, a living, breathing warmth, filled the chamber for the first time. She sat before it, weeping with relief and exhaustion, the firelight dancing on the earthen walls of the world she was building. Water was the next challenge. For weeks, she had been making a daily trek to a small stream in the ravine, a journey that cost her precious time and energy. But as she dug deeper, expanding a new section for storage, the clay grew damper. Then, one afternoon, her shovel struck a patch of earth that did not just feel damp, it oozed. Water, clean and cold, began to seep slowly from the wall. She had tapped into a deep, underground spring. Working frantically, she dug a small basin, a pit at the base of the seep. The water pooled in it, slow but steady. To make it permanent, she lined the entire pit with a thick layer of the purest clay she could find, packing it down until it was smooth and watertight. She had built a cistern, a source of fresh water deep inside her own home, shielded from the dust of summer and the ice of winter. It worked. With shelter, heat, and water secured, her thoughts turned to food. She had her small sack of flour and the salt, but it would not last. She needed a way to grow things. An outdoor garden was impossible on the Scrabble. The wind and poor soil would kill any seedling. The answer, she realized, had to be the same as everything else: go deeper. She designated a third chamber, the largest yet, as her garden. But the clay inside was sterile. Plants needed soil. For the next 2 weeks, she undertook the most back-breaking task of all. She located a small hollow, a quarter-mile away, where centuries of fallen leaves had decayed into a rich, black loam. She filled her satchel with this precious earth and hauled it back, load by agonizing load. Down into her shelter, into the garden chamber, she spread the soil, creating a series of raised beds 6 inches deep. It took hundreds of trips. Her body was a single, unified ache. But when she was done, she had a patch of perfect, fertile earth, hidden from the wind and the frost. It was time to return to Providence Gulch. She needed seeds, supplies, and most importantly, livestock. She washed in the cold water of her cistern, put on her one clean change of linen, and walked back toward the town she had fled. Walking into Mr. Gable's mercantile was like stepping into another world. The noise, the smells, the press of people. It was overwhelming after months of solitude. Her appearance caused an immediate silence. She was leaner, her skin weathered by sun and wind, her hands calloused and stained with earth. She looked wild. Mr. Gable stared at her as if she were an apparition. "Ilara, we thought you'd moved on." "I need supplies," she said, ignoring the whispers that had started to ripple through the store. She placed a list on the counter, written on a piece of stripped bark. Sacks of potatoes, carrots, and turnips. Seeds for kale, beets, and hardy beans. More salt. Kerosene for a lantern she'd found discarded. He read the list, his eyebrows climbing his forehead. "This is a winter's worth of storage. For what?" "For my root cellar," she said simply. A man leaning against the counter, a trapper named Brant, known for his loud mouth, let out a bark of laughter. "Root cellar? Girl, you'd need a cellar the size of this store to hold all that. What'd you do? Scratch a hole with your fingernails?" Ilara ignored him. "I also need to buy 3 laying hens and a milking goat. A pregnant one, if you know of any for sale." The store erupted in muffled laughter. The idea was absurd. A woman living alone on the Scrabble, a place that couldn't support a field mouse, was buying livestock. Brant slapped his knee. "Gonna keep 'em in your pocket, little mole? Or maybe you dug a burrow big enough for all of you?" The nickname was born in that moment. The Mole Woman. The Barrow Wife. She paid for her goods with the small amount of money she'd earned selling scavenged firewood to a passing wagon train. It took almost all she had. Mr. Gable, to his credit, found her the animals. As she was tying the goat's lead to her wrist and figuring out how to carry the crate of squawking chickens, the door opened. It was Mr. Davies. He saw her. He saw the supplies, the goat, the chickens. His face, already a mask of stern disapproval, hardened into contempt. He looked at her, then at the audience in the store, and gave a short, derisive shake of his head before turning and walking out. It was a public declaration. This woman was not just a fool. She was a disgrace to his son's memory. As Ilara led her small, noisy procession out of town, a scruffy, one-eared dog that had been sleeping under the mercantile porch got up and started to follow her. It kept a cautious distance, but it followed. When she stopped to rest, it stopped too, watching her with intelligent, weary eyes. She offered it a crust of bread. It snatched it gently. By the time she reached the Scrabble, the dog was walking by her side. She had a companion. She named him Buster. The mockery from town followed her, becoming a part of the landscape like the wind. Riders would sometimes come out from Providence Gulch on a Sunday, treating her homestead as a morbid curiosity. They would stop at the edge of her property and stare at the enormous, growing mound of excavated earth and rock that snaked away from the hillside. They saw a pile of dirt. They called it Ilara's Folly. They never saw the solid, timber-framed door set deep into the hillside, or the thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke that curled from the hidden fissure in the rock above. Brant, the trapper, was the most vocal. He rode by one afternoon, reining in his horse and looking down at her as she worked to widen the entrance. "Still digging to China, barrow wife," he called out, a grin splitting his bearded face. "You'll be eating dirt and rocks come winter. You should have taken Gable's advice and run." She did not reply. She just lifted another rock, her silence a wall he could not penetrate. His laughter followed him as he rode away. The name stuck. In town, she was no longer Ilara Davies. She was the barrow wife, the mad woman digging her own grave. As autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and rust, Ilara worked to secure her world for the coming cold. She built a small, connected chamber for the goat and the chickens, its entrance inside the main living space. Their body heat would add to the warmth of the shelter, and their safety from predators would be absolute. Buster claimed a spot on a pile of dried grasses near the hearth, his presence a steady, comforting warmth. The deep winter settled in not with a gentle blanket of snow, but with a hard, bitter frost that turned the world to iron. She sealed the heavy wooden door, chinking the edges with a mixture of clay and straw. Her world shrank to the interconnected chambers she had carved from the earth. Outside, the wind screamed its fury. Inside, there was a profound and peaceful quiet. Her days fell into a new rhythm, one of quiet sustenance. In the morning, she would light the lantern in the garden chamber. The plants, shielded from the killing frost, thrived in the rich soil. She harvested kale and beet greens, their vibrant color a miracle in the subterranean gloom. She would milk the goat, its warm milk a luxury beyond price. The chickens provided an egg nearly every day, a small, perfect treasure. She tended the fire, checked her stores of potatoes and carrots, mended her worn dress by the flickering light. Buster would sleep at her feet, his occasional sighs the only sound to break the stillness. The solitude was immense, a vast ocean of silence. But it was not lonely. She was the sovereign of this small, warm, living kingdom. She was not just surviving. She was presiding over a world of her own creation, a world that worked. The systems she had built were tested. A week of heavy, freezing rain sent a trickle of water under the door. She spent a day digging a drainage trench and building a raised threshold, solving the problem. One night, a pack of wolves, driven by hunger, circled her shelter, their howls thin and sharp in the cold air. They scratched at the door, but the thick planks held. Buster's deep, ferocious barking from within was the only reply they received. They eventually moved on. Each small test, each victory, hardened her resolve and deepened her trust in what she had built. She thought of the towns sometimes, imagining them in their wooden houses, gathered around their own fires. They were probably warm enough, she thought. Their barns were full, their larders stocked. They had community, neighbors, security. They had everything she did not. And they believed her to be freezing and starving in a shallow, muddy hole, a pitiful creature paying the price for her foolish pride. The town was wrong. The blizzard arrived in the first week of February. It was not a storm. It was a war. It came from the north, a solid wall of white that erased the world. The wind did not howl. It shrieked like a predator, a physical force that clawed at anything that stood against it. It carried ice and frozen earth, scouring the landscape like a massive, grinding stone. It was the blizzard the old-timers would later call the White Death, the blizzard of '83. In Providence Gulch, the assault was catastrophic. The wind, funneled by the valley, hit the town with the force of a hammer. It stripped shingles from roofs in the first hour, leaving rafters exposed to the driving snow. The fine, powdery snow was driven through every crack and keyhole, piling in silent, ghostly drifts inside locked rooms. Mr. Gable's grand store window, his pride and joy, shattered with a sound like a cannon shot, and the blizzard poured into his store, burying his goods in a tomb of white. Families huddled in their homes, stuffing rags into the gaps in their doors and windows. But the cold was a living thing, an insidious presence that seeped through the wooden walls. Firewood, stacked neatly outside homes, was buried under 10-foot drifts, inaccessible. As fires began to dwindle, a deep, terrifying chill set in. In the barns, livestock, the lifeblood of the community, began to die, their frozen bodies stiffening in the stalls. The roof of the meeting hall groaned under the impossible weight of the snow, and then cracked with a sound that sent terror through the heart of the town. Their confidence, their certainty in their own sturdy, conventional world, shattered like the glass of the mercantile window. Under 10 feet of snow and earth, Ilara knew of the storm only as a distant, muffled roar. The wind could not touch her. The cold could not find her. The temperature in her burrow remained stable, cool but not freezing, warmed by the steady, radiant heat from her stone hearth. The fire drew perfectly, its smoke whisked away by the hidden fissure. Her animals were calm. The goat chewed its cud placidly, and the chickens scratched in their pen. Buster slept by the fire, his ears occasionally twitching at a particularly violent gust that managed to send a faint vibration through the ground. She milked the goat. She collected an egg. She watered the bright green plants in her garden chamber. She was an island of impossible warmth and order in a world that had descended into frozen chaos. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. The earth had taken her in, and the earth was holding her safe. On the third day of the blizzard, the banging on her door was so faint she almost missed it. It was a weak, desperate drumming, nearly lost in the low thrum of the storm above. Buster heard it first. He shot to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest, and ran to the entrance. Ilara quieted him with a hand on his back and pressed her ear to the thick wood. She heard it again, a frantic, exhausted scratching. It took all her strength to shift the bar and pull the heavy door inward against the pressure of the snowdrift outside. A figure, a shapeless mound of white, tumbled into the entranceway and collapsed onto the earthen floor. It was a man, his face a mask of ice and frozen blood, his clothes stiff with frost. She dragged him inside, away from the biting wind, and forced the door shut again, barring it against the storm. As she rolled the man over, the lantern light fell on his face. It was Brant, the trapper, the man who had laughed the loudest, who had christened her the Barrow Wife. He was half dead, his breathing shallow, his skin a deathly gray. For a single, cold moment, she hesitated. Every scornful word, every mocking laugh, echoed in the quiet of her shelter. He represented the town that had cast her out, the people who had wished for her failure. To leave him where he fell would be a kind of justice. Her stores were carefully rationed. Helping him would come at a cost to her own survival. But the moment passed. He was not an idea. He was a dying man on her floor. She was not the person they thought she was, a creature of dirt and bitterness. She had built this world not out of spite, but out of a ferocious will to live. And life, she now understood, was not meant to be hoarded. She knelt beside him and began the work of saving his life. With practiced, steady hands, she cut away his frozen coat and boots. His skin was waxy and cold to the touch. She stripped off the icy layers of clothing and wrapped him in the 2 spare blankets she owned, pulling him as close to the fire as she dared. She ladled broth from the pot simmering over the hearth, a thin but nourishing soup made from salted goat meat and winter vegetables, and forced a few spoonfuls between his cracked, blue lips. She worked for an hour, rubbing his hands and feet to restore circulation, piling more wood on the fire until the chamber was thick with warmth. Slowly, life began to seep back into him. A shudder ran through his body. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. He stared at the earthen ceiling, the flickering lantern, the impossible sight of green plants growing in a nearby chamber. "Where?" he croaked, his voice a dry rasp. "You're safe," Elara said. "You're at the Scrabble." His eyes finally focused on her, and a look of profound disbelief dawned on his face. He tried to push himself up, but collapsed back, his body too weak. He was in the madwoman's hole, the place of jokes and pity. But it was not a hole. It was warm. It was dry. It smelled of wood smoke and cooking food. It was more of a home than the freezing, storm-battered house he had left behind. He began to talk, his words tumbling out in a panicked, breathless rush. He told her of the town, of roofs collapsed and families trapped, of the Gable boy, sick with a lung fever, his ragged breathing growing weaker by the hour. They had run out of firewood 2 days ago and were burning furniture to stay alive. They were starving. They were freezing. Providence Gulch was dying. Elara listened without expression. When he was finished, she stood up and began to move with quiet purpose. She went to her stores and filled a large sack with potatoes and dried beans. She went to her garden and harvested a bundle of kale and medicinal herbs she had grown from seeds her mother had taught her to value. She went to her woodpile, stacked deep and dry against the back wall, and began loading a small, sturdy sled she had built for hauling timber. Brant watched her, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. He saw the neat, ordered shelves of preserved food. He saw the healthy, calm animals. He saw the miracle of the subterranean garden. He saw the towering stack of firewood, enough to last 2 more months. He was not in a grave. He was in an ark. He struggled to sit up, his voice cracking with shame. "We called you mad," he whispered, the words barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "We laughed. My God, we were the fools, all of us." Elara did not acknowledge his confession. She finished loading the sled and dragged it to the door. She wrapped a heavy oilcloth over the supplies to keep them dry and handed Brant a length of rope. "The wind is from the north," she said, her tone purely practical. "If you keep the black ridge to your left, it will give you some cover for the first mile. The snow is not as deep there." Her grace was more cutting than any accusation. She offered no reproach, no, "I told you so." She offered only help. It was a form of forgiveness so absolute it was crushing. Brant could not meet her eyes. He took the rope, his hand trembling. I can't ask you to," he stammered. "I'm not doing it for you," she said, finally looking at him. Her eyes were not angry, just clear and steady. "I'm doing it for the boy." She whistled sharply. Buster came to her side, his tail giving a short, questioning wag. She knelt and spoke softly to the dog, stroking his one good ear. "Go with him, Buster. See him home." The dog seemed to understand. He licked her hand, then turned and stood by Brant, ready. She opened the door and the storm roared in. Together they pushed the sled out into the blinding white. Brant turned back one last time, his face etched with a pain that went deeper than the cold. He saw her standing in the warm, lit doorway of the world she had built, a lone, unshakable figure against the darkness. Then she closed the door, and he was alone with the dog, the sled, and the long, impossible journey back to the town he had failed. When the blizzard finally broke 2 days later, the world was reborn in a shroud of blinding white under a pale, exhausted sun. The silence was deafening. Providence Gulch was a town entombed. The survivors dug themselves out, their faces gaunt with hunger and shock. The story Brant told, gasping and frostbitten as he stumbled into the gable house with the sled and the dog, had already spread. He had come back from the dead, led from the wilderness by a ghost and her dog, bearing food and firewood from the Barrow wife's mythical burrow. The firewood had saved the Gable boy's life. The food had been the first real meal many had eaten in days. It was not charity, it was a miracle. A party of men, led by a humbled Mr. Gable and a silent, grim-faced Brant, made their way to the Scrabble that afternoon. The journey was arduous, a struggle through chest-deep drifts. Among them, walking at the back, was Mr. Davies. He had lost over half his herd, his wealth and authority frozen in the fields. They arrived to find Elara clearing snow from her entrance, Buster at her side. She watched them approach, her expression unreadable. Mr. Gable stepped forward, his hat in his hands. "Elara," he began, his voice thick with emotion. There are no words. You saved my son. You saved us." He gestured to the other men, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and deep, profound shame. "We have come to ask, to trade for more of your stores. We will pay any price you ask." Elara looked at their faces, one by one. She saw their desperation, their broken pride. She had the power to refuse, to let them suffer the consequences of their judgment. But that was their way, not hers. "The price is fair," she said, her voice even. $1 for a sack of potatoes, same as your store charges." The generosity of the act was a physical blow. They had come expecting to be punished, to be made to pay for their cruelty. Instead, they were met with simple, honest commerce. She led them into her home. The sight that greeted them silenced any remaining doubt. They stared, slack-jawed, at the warm, dry, well-lit chambers. They saw the neat rows of vegetables, the healthy animals, the towering stacks of wood. They were standing inside the fable Brant had told them, and it was all real. Mr. Davies stood at the edge of the group, his face a mask of warring emotions. He looked at the sturdy timber supports, the ingenious chimney, the life-giving cistern. This was not madness. This was brilliance. This was a fortress of resilience built by the woman he had discarded. He had given her a grave, and she had transformed it into a womb. He turned without a word and walked back out into the snow, his pride a heavier burden than any drift. In the weeks that followed, the relationship between Elara and Providence Gulch was irrevocably transformed. The derisive nickname, the Barrow wife, was never spoken in scorn again. It became a title, a legend. They would say, "The Barrow wife says the frost will be late this year," or "Ask the Barrow wife how to shore up a cellar wall." She became their source of wisdom, her hard-won knowledge a currency more valuable than gold. The following summer, the sound of digging became common in the valley. Families, terrified by the memory of the White Death, began excavating deeper, more robust cellars beneath their homes. They came to Elara, not with mockery, but with humble questions about ventilation, drainage, and structural support. She shared her knowledge freely, teaching them the language of the earth she had been forced to learn alone. The town, scarred but not broken, began to rebuild itself on a foundation of her resilience. Mr. Davies never spoke to her directly. His apology came in his actions. One evening, she found a fine wool blanket left at her door. A week later, a young, healthy cow was tethered outside. He lost his standing as the unquestioned patriarch of the valley. His power had been in his wealth, and the blizzard had proven wealth to be a fragile shield against the wrath of nature. True power, the community now understood, was in the quiet, dirt-stained hands of his daughter-in-law. Years passed. The Scrabble was no longer a barren hill, but a place of unlikely abundance. Elara had expanded her underground world, adding a cheese cave, a larger pantry, and a workshop. The pile of excavated earth, once a monument to her supposed folly, was now covered in terraced beds where she grew hardy vegetables in the summer sun. Her home became a landmark, a testament to the power of seeing value where others saw only waste. Travelers carried the story of the Barrow wife of Providence Gulch to other towns, a frontier legend of survival and quiet strength. One warm spring evening, Elara sat at the entrance to her home, an old woman now, her hair the color of snow. A descendant of Buster lay sleeping at her feet. She looked out over the valley, at the lights of the town twinkling in the dusk. She was not an outcast. She was not a widow. She was the woman who had listened to the earth when the world of men had turned its back on her. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a life, carved not from the pity of others, but from the stubborn, unyielding strength of her own two hands. Her legacy was written in stone and soil, a quiet lesson that the deepest roots often grow in the hardest ground.